one of the things that was very significant to me in looking at this question was that in many places, this is a process of trying to make, in fact, a radical change in the way that women dress. Not at all a process of trying to preserve, quote, tradition. And I think very often the assumption that is made in the debate about the veil in the West is that it is somehow protecting what is called the right to veil, is protecting a cultural status quo, when in fact in many contexts the veil itself and sort of the purveying of veiling and more restrictive forms of veiling are indeed about changing the way that women dress, are indeed about challenging pre-existing cultural status quos. That's not true everywhere, but that's true in many of the contexts that I visited. And I was sort of struck last week in talking to a very prominent Palestinian-American academic who sort of exclaimed to me in horror, "Karima, do you realize there are niqabs in Cairo now?" Niqabs in Cairo. And he was so astonished for a person of his generation by this. And I think for some sort of liberal human rights supporting Westerners, it sounds like that maybe that's the way it's always been. But in fact, for many people in Arab and other Muslim contexts, they are experiencing this as a very radical change from the way that things were, from the way that things were when they were growing up. And, as the wife of this professor then said to me, when I was at university in Cairo in the 60s, there was not a single woman student at the university who covered her head, and now a significant majority does. So again, really a sense of a shift, and I think we need to understand that as opposed to a sense of preserving something called tradition in many places. In my travels, I saw some of the garments that were shown here, in particular niqabs, which represent a very big shift, particularly in the last few years. Niqabs in Algiers, niqabs near the Damascus Gate in the old city of Jerusalem. And another thing that really struck me that is not portrayed in this debate is how frightening that development was to some other women who make other choices about their dress in the same context, and their very grave concern that they will be pressured towards more and more restrictive garments, and in fact that their daughters will have significantly less choice about dress than they have had. Now, one of the arguments made by those defending veiling is that it is an authentic practice or a traditional practice. But something that was very interesting to me in doing this research is that in fact many of the garments that we put in the veil category are not at all indigenous to the contexts where they are being deployed or increasingly deployed. So for example, I visited Niger, and women in Niger traditionally wear boubous with accompanying headdresses that have nothing to do with the hijabs or the jilbabs that fundamentalists in Niger are now encouraging women to wear. 5 minutes, thanks. For the women I interviewed in Niger, in fact, the rise of fundamentalism is precisely about de-Africanizing their lived practice of Islam, including with regard to the way that they dress. During my time in Algiers this fall, I saw women in jilbabs and in increasingly ubiquitous hijabs, but I also saw women in dizzying microskirts that I never would have worn when I was living in Algiers as a younger person. And while in the sort of liberal prism one set of garments may seem to be authentic and the other simply Western, in fact neither is actually indigenous to Algeria. If everyone wore their authentic indigenous garments, you would not see jilbabs or hijabs on the streets of Algiers. You would see Algeroise women, and in the capital, wearing embroidered serwals, which are actually Turkish influence, so maybe not entirely indigenous either. You would see Kabyle women in satin brocaded dresses with striped aprons, and Constantinoise women from the East in velour ensembles with gold trim, and so on. What one finds living or traveling in Muslim-majority contexts is that Muslims are, after all, surprise, surprise, as complicated and diverse a human and cultural category as anyone else. And that is something that disappears, I think, all too often in this debate about veiling, and indeed in the process of sort of pushing veiling, which has been described by the Algerian journalist Mohamed Sifawi as a practice of uniforming Muslim women. Now note that there has been pushback on that from women who choose to veil themselves, some of whom have started to employ elaborate fashion and all sorts of different kinds of veils. My father actually had a graduate student who did an interesting thesis on fashion in veiling. But nevertheless, I think the idea of it as it is viewed by fundamentalists is very much as a uniform. And let me just, to sort of bolster that claim, let me read you a fatwa that was put out by the European Council of Fatwas and Research, which has been pushing ceaselessly for all Muslim women in Europe to veil. And they said in the fatwa, "We are determined to convince the Muslim woman that covering her head is a religious obligation. God has prescribed this modest dress and the scarf for the Muslim woman so that she can be distinguished from the non-Muslim woman and the non-practicing woman. Thus, by her dress, she presents herself as a serious and honest woman who is neither a seductress nor a temptress, who does no wrong either by her words or by any movement of her body, so that he whose heart is perverse cannot be tempted by her." Now imagine the operation of choice in the universe described by this fatwa. Because your choice then is to be seen as a Muslim by covering, or to not be a Muslim by not covering. To be a serious and honest woman if you do cover, or to be a seductress and a temptress if you do not. To be one who does wrong if you do, or to be one who does not do wrong. Sorry, now I got that backwards. To be one who does wrong if you do not cover, and who does not do wrong if you do. How will you then choose in this universe? And what does your choice mean? And how does it sort of transform their agenda, that is this council, into an expression of your free will? I think all of those are very, very complicated questions. There were so many other things that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to bring in the issue of racism, which I do think is very important as this issue comes up in the West, although I do think that we really need to understand this problem in the global context. Somebody mentioned the importance of global context in the question and answer period this morning. And I think we also have to recognize the tremendous contestation going on among people we label Muslims themselves. Very different views. There is a strong argument to be made, for example, that a majority of Muslims in France actually support the 2004 law banning ostentatious religious symbols in public schools because they're concerned about the rise of fundamentalism in their own population. Very big debate in the Muslim population there. When I was in Pakistan this fall, I picked up some plays by Shahid Nadim, who is the playwright who works with the Ajoka Theatre Group in Lahore. And one of the plays that he wrote is called Burqa Vaganza, and it actually takes on all of these very complex issues about attitudes toward veiling in Muslim-majority contexts, but also in the West. The play was almost immediately banned, and one of the really interesting things about the play is that every character, male and female, appears in a burqa from the beginning of the play all the way through to the end, when they take off the burqas and reveal faces underneath, which are in fact masks of prominent politicians. But nevertheless, I think this idea of contestation about this issue, rather than understanding it as a naturalized, traditional, or quote, simply authentic practice, is incredibly important to bring to the table when we think about the kind of debate we might want to have about veiling.